This is Ahval Online, meeting point of accurate news and free comment on the current affairs of Turkey. Welcome to our podcast series.
Hello, my name is Nicholas Morgan. I'm an editor at Ahval News, and this is Turkey Abroad. Joining me this morning is Mohammed Soliman. He is a non-resident fellow at the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. Mohammed, pleasure to have you at Turkey Abroad today.
Thank you, Nick. It's my pleasure.
So we came across an article that you wrote for the Middle East Institute talking about the emergence of what you describe as an Indo-Abrahamic order that brings together the interests of in this case, the Gulf Arab countries like the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and India. And there was also some mention about how these interests might align even further to include countries in the Eastern Mediterranean like Greece. And it was a really interesting idea that you put forward in this article. But the first thing I'd like to ask you, Mohammed, is if you can describe for our listeners the contours of this emerging Indo-Abrahamic bloc.
Thank you, Nick. That's an excellent question. It's a framework to understand the bilateral and trilateral relations between India, Israel, the UAE, and other parties like Saudi Arabia and Greece in the East Med. And it's more of a forecasting for what's organically happening over the last few years. It has been an emerging trend. Part of that started with Turkey's foreign policy. It took a very assertive nature. Also, the realignment between Turkey and Pakistan that also added the Indo as a component to this Abrahamic alliance. So it became an Indo-Abrahamic trans-regional order from my own point of view.
This wouldn't be Turkey Abroad, of course, if we didn't bring up the Turkey aspect in all of this, which I found was really interesting to note inside your article, because Turkey comes up a number of times over the year. It's a factor that built up over the years because of its really muscular and assertive foreign policy across the Middle East and the Eastern Mediterranean. And it rubbed many of these countries the wrong way, of course. I mean, relations are still, fair to say, pretty poor between Turkey and each of these countries. But how much of a role would you say that Turkey played in this emergence? Because just very quickly, it makes me think about some of the past conversations that I've had on this podcast with previous guests who talked about the Turkey's large but unstated role in, say, previous other deals and alignments that we saw in the past, like whether it was the Greece-Israel alignment or even the Abraham Accords. Where is Turkey falling in with this?
It's an excellent question. Turkey in the last few years, again, I'm trying to present the view from these regional international capitals. So I'm not analyzing Turkey. I'm not a Turkey expert. So this is my caveat here. I'm trying to interpret Turkey's actions overseas, abroad. Erdogan's Turkey, in terms of foreign policy, moved from a zero enemy foreign policy to a zero friend foreign policy over a few years. And regional capitals were basically distrustful from that kind of assertive foreign policy. The fact that Turkey is doing a power projection and across different geostrategic theaters. It's from North Africa, Libya, to East Med, to Somalia in the Horn of Africa, to Azerbaijan, Armenia, Afghanistan, and Pakistan to some extent in Central Asia and Southeast Asia. So there's that kind of sense that Turkey is everywhere. In addition, of course, to the support for Islamist movements across the Middle East, some sort of intervention in Iraq and Syria. So there was some sort of distrust from that kind of assertive foreign policy. And there's some sort of a feel that Turkey's foreign policy is more about dominance, not coexistence with regional powers and other nations in the region. So that was in my opinion, was a very main driver for a lot of these realignments that happened. As you mentioned, Greece, Israel, the East Med gas forum that includes Egypt, Greece, Cyprus, Israel, and many European nations and United States as an observer. Again, even the Abrahamic agreements from last year, they included UE per se and Israel. I think that there's, as long as there is, of course, an Iranian component, but there's a Turkish component to these kind of deals.
And that part that you said right there, the way you phrase it is like there's an Iranian element in it, of course, too, which, you know, I think was maybe the immediate reaction to, say, in the Abraham Accords case, that it was aimed at isolating Iran further. But then the Turkey one seems almost like it occupies a larger slice in some ways than Iran. And in my mind, it could be because of the comparative difference between the countries, where Iran sure has an extended network of proxies and built pressure points across the region against their rivals, be it Israel, Saudi Arabia, the UAE. But it makes me think about a conversation I had with Seth Frantzman after the Abraham Accords on this podcast, where he said that if anything, Turkey might be occupying a larger slice of the concerns because of its relative, even at this weakened state with its economy right now and the political divisions in the country, it's still a more powerful country overall that concerns them. Makes me think about the head of the Mossad allegedly told the heads of other intelligence agencies that Iran's threat is manageable, basically, but Turkey's the threat over the horizon in his assessment. So what do you think about that? Do you think that Turkey is at this point still occupying a bit more of the space in their strategic thinking about this than Iran, or how should we understand that?
It depends on where you are in the region. So let's talk about the Middle East. What's the Middle East? I do believe the Middle East is a non-existing term. It doesn't describe reality. You have the Gulf states, you have the Levant, and you have North Africa. And these three sub-regions have their own grievances and their own geostrategic interest. North Africa is completely distant from the Shia-Sunni rivalry that has dominated geopolitics of the Arabian Gulf for the last arguably 50 years. So the North Africa, from Cairo to Tripoli to Tunis, Algeria, and Marrakesh, they're completely distant. They care about the Mediterranean. Mediterranean is their own geostrategic theater. This is where all their interests are, majority of their own interests are, and Turkish incursions and assertive foreign policy in Libya, power projection in Libya and East Med is a huge concern for these nations. So yes, if you are Egypt or Israel, Cyprus, and Greece, this is your very, very immediate concern. Levant, again, I think their main concern is absolutely Iran for a lot of obvious reasons. The Gulf, I think, is very interesting. I think the Gulf is between both. There's an immediate Iranian threat that's coming from the fact that Iran is next door, and they have the capabilities to strike some of these Gulf states, like what we have seen at Abqaiq and Khurais in Saudi Arabia 2 years ago, and Iranian proxies, what's happening in Yemen. So there's real concern, and Iran is taking, I would say, half of the thinking of these capitals. But also Turkey emerged as another threat in the last couple of years. That was never the case. Part of that is power projection. Turkey is capable of pursuing power projection policy overseas. And that caused a lot of concern for capitals. Let's speak about one incident, the Qatar incident. The fact that Turkey can quickly deploy forces and quickly be in a certain country and somehow create fait accompli against the will of the neighboring countries, that created a lot of fears, distrust, and since that Turkey is not only here to stay, it's coming from our own countries afterwards. Mm-hmm. So if Turkey is coming to our own sphere of interest, we have to go to Turkey's sphere of interest. So this why UAE and Saudi Arabia have this kind of close coordination with Greece, Cyprus, and East Med, because this is the only way they can respond to Turkey in the Gulf policy. So that started to be the major trend for the last few years.
I'd like to single out the East Mediterranean for a moment in there, because another guest of mine that I spoke to on this podcast, not necessarily about this topic, but it's related to the idea that her name is Caroline Rose. She's at the New Lines Institute, also in Washington, and she talked about how we are seeing this trend in which there's a blending of strategic interests, say, between like the East Mediterranean countries and the Gulf countries. And to put it another way, you have on the one hand the partnerships formed by the Abraham Accords, then becoming aligned with the deepening partnerships between Greece, Cyprus, and Israel, and it's creating this almost like this axis of countries that are brought together largely because of this shared distrust, it seems, of Turkey, just in way and timing that it seemed to take shape, like within the East Mediterranean Gas Forum, the Turkish incursions into the Eastern Mediterranean, its policy in Libya. Do you think that at this point it's now do you think that this East Mediterranean Gulf Alliance then is going to be joining this Indo Gulf Israel alliance at that point? It's like you're seeing it almost like a consequence of Turkish foreign policy, a long-term consequence that they now have a wide arc of nations that appear opposed to them. Would you say that this could be fairly called a consequence of Turkey's aggressive foreign policy, in that sense, that they've encouraged these countries to institutionalize like a larger network of partnerships?
To some extent, I can argue that with this level of assertiveness in Turkey's foreign policy, it blended interest across different strategic theaters. These interests were never converged. I think they converged because of the spectrum and the many strategic theaters that Turkey is operating in. From, as we mentioned, North Africa to East Med to Central Asia, the Arabian Gulf, and the Levant. For these nations, they're everywhere. And because Turkey is everywhere, we have to be with a close proximity to Turkey. So it was a very natural progression based on this fact that Turkey is encouraging to some extent on many of these countries' national interests and direct sphere of influence. I do believe that this is the main driver. To your second part of your question about an East Med Gulf India alliance, yeah, absolutely. And this is what I'm saying. I'm saying that there is this transitional order is on the rise. It's my own forecasting that this is a natural progression, that this is going to happen within the upcoming few years. And for instance, the Greeks, Greece called for establishing a trilateral dialogue with the UAE and India. And India, this is the country that's really far away from that strategic theater. UAE is far, but still it's part of the Middle East, part of the Gulf. It has its own interests, gas interests. It makes sense that there is a strategic dialogue formed between Greece, Israel, and UAE. But for Greece to call for a UAE and India, that tells you that this kind of thinking exists in many of these capitals. Because once you add Israel to the blender, once you add Israel and Egypt to that kind of dialogue, you have it. You have the biggest Arab nation, Egypt. You have the heart of Islam, Saudi Arabia, and you have India, which is the biggest democracy in the world with a nuclear state, and you have Israel, the only nuclear state in the Middle East. So that kind of trajectory is happening. It's slow because, again, it's huge convergence of interest. We're speaking about India, Israel, Greece, UAE, Egypt, Saudi Arabia. To bring all these nations together you need something that's more than Turkey. If Turkey accelerated a trend, but this trend is going to be natural, its own formation, and also needs a soul searching for, so what if you have some sort of political changes in Turkey? How this going to impact that kind of progression? Is it going to end because the threat is not there? So I think we are in a period of questions, projections. I'm trying to ask the right questions, and I don't believe that I have all the right answers right now.
Your inclusion of India, I thought, was something really interesting also in there, because I had a podcast recently where I spoke about Turkish-India relations with Nayana Basu. She's an editor at the Print, and she had an interview with the Turkish ambassador where he essentially told her that he saw no problems with India. He said that their relationship did not need a reset in any way, and that good ties already existed. And it seems that that was a pretty optimistic take on the relationship, from what I understand, because for when you include India in this, it makes me think almost like we have the contours of the Indo-Abrahamic alliance that we're talking about, but then what are the contours of the counter alliances? What comes to mind there? Because for India, to me, it seems that more of these concerns revolve around their traditional concerns related to Pakistan, and Pakistan at least has traditionally had good relations with Saudi Arabia and the UAE, but has tacked closer to Turkey in recent years. So are we seeing also like a deepening of the counter alliance at a parallel time, like say Turkey and Pakistan in this case? I don't know if I would include Iran in that, or Qatar necessarily, but between those two, at the very least, there seems to be much more convergence. What do you think?
This is the 1 million question. This is a very, very tough question. Turkey and India in general, from my own perspective, and I'm not an India expert, also a caveat here, but I'm telling you the interpretations. They are complete opposite ideologically. Not only because right now the person that's running Turkey is President Erdogan and the person in charge of India is Prime Minister Modi, but the countries are strategically different. Like how the Hinduism is very integrated in the strategic thinking of India, and how political Islam right now is very integrated in the strategic thinking of Turkey. And this is going to live even if Prime Minister Modi and President Erdogan are not running these two capitals tomorrow. And this is something that when you talk to strategic thinkers in these capitals, acknowledge. For India, right now we have Hindu nationalism is the most dominant force in Indian politics. In Turkey, you have President Erdogan's ideology very dominant. It has been solid, I can argue, for the last 20 years. I'm not sure about the future, but it's still dominant force. It's not going to be in the back seat anytime soon. So this is on the ideological side. On the geostrategic interest side, the two countries also were always at odds. During the Cold War, they were playing for different camps. Turkey was the guardian of the Eastern Gate for NATO, and India, not only a leader of the non-alignment movement, it was also a very
pro-Soviet.
Soviet Union. Yeah, most of the countries that were part of NAM, the non-alignment movement, were sympathizing with the Soviet cause against colonization and the West in general. So they were opposite. And there was a period of opening in 1990s to early 2000s after the end of Cold War, transactional, much more about trade, about economics, rather than geostrategic alignment. But then once President Erdogan and Prime Minister Modi made it to power, that was a game changer. It's Hindu nationalism versus international Islamism. And these two political ideologies are on collision course. Again, strategically, President Erdogan criticized India for Kashmir many times. Turkey very vocal about not allowing India into the nuclear sub-Laras group, which is very, very important for India's nuclear capabilities in general. And Turkey was doing that on behalf of Pakistan. So there is that kind of grievances that exist there. And then you add another layer to that, which is when Turkey goes to Afghanistan, this is beyond the ideology, and this is beyond some remarks in the UN and some diplomatic tensions. This is geostrategic, the geostrategic theater that's very important to India, where India feels it's vulnerable. India feels that if Taliban took over power in Kabul, and they already did, this means that all this American-made equipment is going to show up in Kashmir next day. This is how people think in Delhi. So if you bring Turkey, and also what happened in Afghanistan is perceived as a win and victory for Pakistan, then you have a problem. Then you have the Indian strategic interest is being threatened by Turkey being in alignment with Pakistan and Afghanistan, which is a close proximity to India's strategic and security interests in Asia. So what would be India's response? India's response would be, we're going to the East Med, because this is the strategic theater where India can play a role and can tell Turkey that if you are close to my own borders, I'm going to be close to your own borders. I'm going to be realigning myself with these regional powers and international powers there that I already have a strategic and historic ties with. India is not new to this region. As we know, Prime Minister Nehru and President Nasser were leaders of the non-alignment movement. They have a very historic relations between Cairo and Delhi. Delhi was very supportive of Arab rights and Palestinian rights, have good relationship with most of these capitals. So India is not starting from scratch. And so this is where I see the kind of great conversion of these kind of strategic alignments. The East Med, the Abrahamic Accord, and then the Indo component that India brings to the game.
And what about in say in opposition to that? Do you think that Turkey, because Turkey sometimes talks about this idea of almost like its own axis between Turkey itself, Azerbaijan, and Pakistan, and we've seen at least some measure of coordination at times. Like for example, during the Karabakh War, Pakistan and Turkey both took Azerbaijan's side. Azerbaijan, I'm not quite entirely sure off the top of my head what their position is when it comes to Jammu and Kashmir, but they are a stalwart ally of Turkey, while a bit of a quiet one. They're perceived by Turkey as their main ally in international affairs in many cases, and they also talk about this concept of two nations, one people, to bring them together. But do you think that we're seeing any sort of similar convergence, say, between, in this case, Turkey and Pakistan, that is representing something of a united front in this case against these other alignments that we're talking about?
Yes, but for different reasons. And this reason is the US withdrawal from Afghanistan. With the US leaving Afghanistan right now, the strategic value of Pakistan for Washington will dwindle. Washington will align itself more with India because of the Indo-Pacific. India has a great interest, a great value for the United States strategic thinking when it comes to China, and the Indo-Pacific as a geostrategic theater that dominates the entire conversation in Washington right now. And Pakistan will feel that it's left behind. So Islamabad needs to look for a natural ally, and this natural ally is Turkey. It's a country that aspires to be more than a middle power. It functions across different strategic theaters. It has major capabilities. It has proven to be very effective strategic player, capable of doing power projection across different strategic theaters in similar timelines. And it was there to help Pakistan, and it's willing to help Pakistan in the situation in Afghanistan with Turkey's proposal to secure and operate Kabul airport. We're not sure where this deal stands. However, the Turks are very willing to do this job, which is a very hard job. Pakistan and Turkey alignment will be because of this kind of a geostrategic necessity for Islamabad. Because for some time, Pakistan was still sensitive to full alignment with Turkey because of its own relationship with the two Gulf states, UAE and Saudi Arabia. And this is not only money and diaspora, it's military relations, it's diplomatic support, it's history. So leaving all this behind definitely is not a conservative choice for Pakistan. But for other reasons, I can see Pakistan and Turkey in full strategic alignment because of the US decision to leave Afghanistan.
Speaking of Afghanistan, what do you think are some of the other kind of like fallout risks that face this alliance from the U.S. withdrawal as we approach August 31st? I mean, of course, over the weekend, the Taliban entered Kabul. In the press, we actually even had reports that Turkey had given up on its airport proposal, unless, with the caveat that if the Taliban or whatever government takes shape asks us for help, we will give that help. But their initial idea to jointly run the airport with the United States does appear dead in the water. And then, of course, you have all of the regional countries sort of scrambling to understand what is going to be taking place here, whether it's within these countries that we're talking about right now, or even further afield when we include like Russia and China as well. But aside from the risks that come from Afghanistan opening the door to closer relations between Turkey and Pakistan, what are the consequences do you see affecting this band of countries that we're talking about right now from what we're seeing in Afghanistan?
It's a very important question. I do believe it's an opportunity. Why I believe it's an opportunity? The chaos and the geostrategic uncertainty surrounding the situation in Afghanistan is going to make it very, very hard for international power, global powers, mainly China and Russia, when it comes to their own plans and strategies and visions for connectivity across Asia. Because you can argue that on the map, connectivity in Asia has to go through Central Asia and has to go through, there are many plans that include Afghanistan, either the India, Iran connectivity, and you also have Chinese interests. Destabilization in Afghanistan will make it very hard for commercial and commercial connectivity across this part of the world. And this means naval choke points around Asia will retain its own strategic importance. So India, Gulf, Egypt, Suez to Europe, this is going to be the most dominant commercial connectivity in today's trade and even in the upcoming many years. And that will create an opportunity for much more commercial integration between these nations, much more about geoeconomics in addition to geopolitics. I'm not sure how these nations will make the best out of this situation yet, but that would be the optimal scenario for India, Gulf, Israel, and you have to include Egypt because of the Suez in this case.
Of course. The last question I want to ask you is to kind of, in the spirit of the fact that we're getting close to a year in towards the Abraham Accords, and a few months after the Abraham Accords, we had President Erdogan begin making his announcements of intentions to de-escalate with several of his neighbors, whether it was in the Gulf or Israel or Greece for that matter. We're about almost a year into this so-called charm offensive that Turkey has undergone to lessen its geopolitical isolation. This alliance that you talked about in your paper, it seems to be, as you said, it's developing organically, and it seems to be be taking time to mature, and maybe it's not quite at the level of, it's not fully institutionalized yet. But do you think that as Turkey's attempts to break its own isolation have certainly run into some mixed success in some cases, like with Egypt and Saudi Arabia, that appears to be some warming of relations, but it seems to be running into a wall basically with Israel, the UAE, and Greece. Do you think that there's still an opportunity for Turkey to limit further isolation by seeing this block of countries deepen their relationships? Or do you think do you think that it's too late, and that they have separate issues on maybe each of their parts that are maybe much deeper and structural that Turkey is not willing or able to address in the current state of affairs?
It's a very thoughtful question. I think there is a fundamental change in the way international and regional capitals look into Turkey. When I talk to policymakers and foreign policymakers in Washington, Cairo, Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, the common theme I can find between these foreign policymakers is they don't see a difference between President Erdogan's foreign policy and the Turkish military and diplomatic establishment foreign policy. They simply put, they don't find a differentiation or a difference between Erdogan and Turkey in terms of foreign policy. They believe it's Turkey being Turkey, it's Turkey's aspiration to be a global power. And that will not change even if there is some sort of political change in Ankara through election. This is how they believe. I'm saying that this is how they saw the situation unfolding and how Ankara's foreign policy is being conducted. So I believe that because of this fundamental belief that Turkey is being Turkey, they came to understanding that we need to maintain that kind of geostrategic, political, diplomatic, and military alignment to make sure that Turkey will not expand its own sphere of influence at the expense of our own states. And any kind of sharp offense that comes from President Erdogan is more tactical than strategic. It's more tactical because Turkey right now needs to break the ice and needs to get out from that kind of isolation corner and to have a much more normal relationship with other regional powers, especially after the change that happened in Washington, a different president with different tone and different strategic interests, and also as you mentioned, the economic realities of the Turkish economy itself. So capitals understand that. So they see tactical, not strategic. So they want to maintain the current discourse for that reason. They're entertaining any kind of conversation about de-escalation with Turkey, but they basically lay out their demands very clear. You had the Turkey-Egypt dialogue that happened in Cairo and then happened in Ankara, and Turkey was Egypt was very clear about what it wants. Egypt's interest is not really the Muslim Brotherhood as some in Ankara might believe. They care more about Libya and East Med, and these are Libya is number one, of course, and they care about these issues, and they cannot come down on the list of priorities or items of discussion with Ankara. And if it doesn't go anyway, they're happy with the outcomes because they already have their own geostrategic alignment and they're happy about the status quo so far. The country that's not happy about the status quo is Turkey. So Turkey is trying to make more effort. However, other countries are not receptive.
Mohammed, I feel like we can probably keep going with this conversation. I really enjoy the direction that it's traveled so far, but we've approached the end of the episode right now. So I'd really like to take the time to thank you so much for taking the time to join me today. And I would really like to have you back on in the future.
Nick, thanks so much. Really appreciate it. Have a wonderful day. And our dear listeners, thanks so much for tuning in.
You too. It's been my pleasure. My name is Nicholas Morgan, and this is Turkey Abroad.
You can follow Ahval News Online podcast series through Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Google Podcasts, SoundCloud, and Spreaker. All you need to know about Turkey is here, for your ears, mind, and attention. Thank you for listening to our podcast.